The house settles differently when you're the only one left to hear it. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of wind against the windows, carries a weight that two people used to share. I've been learning the language of solitude for 3 years now, ever since Margaret passed, and tonight the conversation feels particularly pointed. I sit in my leather armchair, the one she insisted we buy for our 40th anniversary, because every man needs a throne in his own castle, nursing a cup of black coffee that's gone cold. The Christmas tree stands in the corner, smaller than the ones Margaret used to insist on, but decorated with the same ornaments we collected over 47 years of marriage. The glass angel on top catches the lamplight, casting fractured rainbows across the wall where our wedding photo hangs. December in Minnesota means early darkness and the kind of cold that seeps through your bones, no matter how well you've built your house. And I built this house well. Every beam, every joint, every piece of trim. I knew where it came from and how it fit. That was back when I ran Holbrook Construction, back when my hands were steady and my back didn't remind me of every ladder I'd climbed and every load I'd carried. The whiskey sits unopened on the side table, a bottle of Macallan 18, the kind Margaret would have called too good for every day, and saved for some special occasion that never quite arrived. I've been saving it for 3 years now, telling myself I'll crack it open when the time feels right. But Christmas Eve doesn't feel right. Not when I'll be spending it alone before heading to David's house tomorrow for what he calls family dinner. Family. The word has taken on new contours since Margaret died. Where it used to mean warmth and belonging, now it carries the sharp edges of obligation and careful politeness. David calls every Sunday dutifully, but our conversations have the rehearsed quality of a man checking items off a list. Claire, his wife of 12 years, sends birthday cards with generic messages and a signature that could have been stamped by machine. The mantel holds our history in silver frames. David at 5, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up the fish we caught at the cabin. David at 18, serious in his graduation cap, already looking toward a future that stretched far beyond our small town. David at 28, arm around Claire on their wedding day, her smile perfect, and his somehow distant even in that moment of supposed joy. That cabin, the lake house we built when David was 10, when Margaret was still talking about grandchildren and summer memories we'd make. 40 acres on Whitefish Lake, 2 hours north of here, with a dock I built by hand and a fireplace where Margaret would read, while I taught David to tie flies for fishing. The place where our son learned to swim, to drive a boat, to appreciate the kind of silence that only comes when you're surrounded by water and trees and nothing that demands your immediate attention. Claire has been mentioning the cabin more often lately. Not directly, never directly, she's too clever for that. But there are comments about how difficult it must be for me to maintain, how sad it seems sitting empty most of the year, how they've been thinking about places to take their future children for vacations. Future children who haven't materialized in 12 years of marriage, though they stopped talking about that particular timeline around year 8. I drain the cold coffee and set the cup on the coaster, Margaret embroidered with tiny poinsettias. The house feels too large around me, filled with empty rooms and unused spaces. The guest bedroom where Margaret's sewing machine still sits under a dust cover. The workshop in the basement where I've been building nothing but birdhouses for the past 3 years, because they're small and simple and don't require the kind of planning that makes you think about the future. Tomorrow, I'll drive to David's house in St. Paul, to the Tudor revival he and Claire bought in Highland Park with money from her father's insurance firm. I'll bring the wine they requested, a specific vintage of Bordeaux that costs more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. And I'll sit at their dining room table and play the role of grateful patriarch, thankful to be included in their modern interpretation of Christmas. But tonight, I allow myself to remember the way Christmas used to feel. Margaret in the kitchen, humming carols while she basted the turkey. The smell of her apple stuffing, made from her mother's recipe, with sage we grew in our own garden. David home from college, later from his job in Minneapolis, filling the house with stories and laughter, and the particular energy of a young man who still believed his parents were worth visiting. The phone rings, cutting through my reverie. David's name appears on the caller ID, and I consider letting it go to voicemail. But that would require an explanation tomorrow, and explanations with my son have become minefields of unspoken resentments and careful word choices. Hello, son. Hi, Dad. Just wanted to confirm tomorrow's timing. We're still planning on 4 o'clock, right? That's what you told me. Great, and you're bringing the wine we discussed? The Bordeaux. Yes, I have it. A pause. In the silence, I can hear Claire's voice in the background, though I can't make out the words. Claire's asking if you need directions. I know you've been to the house before, but I remember how to get to your house, David. Of course. Sorry. We want everything to go smoothly tomorrow. Smoothly. As if Christmas dinner were a business transaction requiring careful management of variables and potential disruptions. As if I were one of those variables. Is there something specific you're worried about? I ask. Another pause, longer this time. No, nothing specific. We've just got a full house this year. Claire's parents are in town, and her brother Tom is bringing his new girlfriend. You remember Tom? I remember Tom, 34 years old and still carrying himself like the college quarterback he used to be, with the easy confidence of a man who's never had to build anything with his own hands. Tom works for Claire's father, managing portfolios for clients who've never worried about where their next paycheck might come from. Should be a nice gathering, I say, though the words taste like ash. It will be. And Dad, maybe we could talk about the cabin situation tomorrow. Claire and I have been discussing some ideas. The cabin situation. 3 words that make my chest tighten. What kind of ideas? Nothing we need to get into tonight. We'll talk tomorrow, okay? After dinner, when things are more relaxed. After dinner, when I've had wine and good food, and am supposed to be feeling grateful and pliant. When the suggestion that I hand over the keys to the place where Margaret and I spent our happiest summers will be presented as a favor to all concerned. A practical solution to the burden of maintenance and the sadness of memories. I'll see you tomorrow, David. See you tomorrow, Dad. And Dad, it's going to be good. You'll see. He hangs up, and I sit holding the phone until it begins to beep its complaint. Through the front window, I can see the Hendersons' house across the street, their Christmas lights twinkling in patterns that Margaret would have said were a bit much, but cheerful. The Hendersons have been married for 38 years. Their children visit every few months, bringing grandchildren who leave toys in the yard and laughter in the air. I wonder if Bill Henderson ever sits in his chair at night, feeling like a stranger in his own family's story. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimes 10 times. Margaret bought that clock at an estate sale in Duluth, insisting it would give the house character. She was right, as she usually was, about such things. The steady tick-tock has been the soundtrack to our life here, marking time through birthdays and anniversaries, through David's childhood and adolescence, through the quiet years after he left for college and the quieter years after Margaret got sick. I reach for the whiskey bottle, then stop. Tomorrow will require clarity, not the false comfort of 18-year-old scotch. Tomorrow will require the kind of careful attention I used to bring to blueprint readings and foundation measurements, when the difference between right and wrong could be measured in fractions of inches and lives depended on getting it exactly right. Standing up from the chair takes more effort than I care to admit. My knees protest, reminding me that 70 years is not 60, and 60 was not 50. But my mind is clear, clearer than it's been in months. As I turn off the lights and make my way upstairs, I catch sight of myself in the hallway mirror. The man looking back has gray hair that Margaret used to trim for me, lines around his eyes that she used to say gave him character, and an expression I haven't seen in 3 years. It's the look of a man who stopped accepting other people's definitions of his place in the world. In the bedroom, I lay out my clothes for tomorrow. The navy suit Margaret helped me pick out for David's wedding, the tie she said brought out my eyes, the shoes I polish myself because some habits die hard. As I fold back the quilt she made during the winter before she died, tiny stitches in a pattern called wedding ring, each fabric piece cut from clothes we'd worn during our marriage, I think about the conversation waiting for me tomorrow, the cabin situation. David and Claire don't know about the papers I've already signed, the documents sitting in Marcus Holcomb's office safe. They don't know about the calls I've made or the decisions I've reached during the long nights when sleep refuses to come and memory insists on replaying every Christmas morning, every summer evening, every quiet moment when Margaret and I planned a future that was supposed to include grandchildren and golden anniversaries and the kind of slow fade that comes to couples who've earned their right to peace. They think they're dealing with a lonely old man who'll be grateful for their attention and generous with his assets. They think grief has made me malleable. That loss has translated into a willingness to give away the physical reminders of what I've lost. They're about to learn how wrong they are. I pull the quilt up to my chin and listen to the house settle around me. Somewhere in the walls, the heating system cycles on with a soft whoosh. The refrigerator hums in the kitchen below. Outside, snow begins to fall, each flake catching the streetlight's glow before disappearing into the growing accumulation on the windowsill. Margaret used to say that snow on Christmas Eve was good luck, a sign that the new year would bring unexpected blessings. She believed in signs and symbols, in the kind of everyday magic that makes ordinary moments feel touched by something larger than ourselves. Tomorrow, I'll give David and Claire a Christmas they'll never forget. I'll give them a conversation about the cabin that will clarify exactly where we all stand. And then I'll come home to this house, to this chair, to this life I've built and maintained and have no intention of apologizing for. The snow continues to fall, and for the first time in 3 years, Christmas Eve feels like the beginning of something, rather than the echo of everything I've lost. Christmas morning arrives with the kind of silence that only comes with fresh snow. I wake at 5:30, the same time I've awakened every day since Margaret died. My body's internal clock, apparently immune to grief and holidays alike. Through the bedroom window, the world has transformed overnight into something clean and unmarked. Every familiar landmark softened by 6 inches of powder that makes the neighborhood look like a Christmas card. But Christmas cards don't capture the weight of dressing alone on Christmas morning, or the echo of footsteps in a house that once held 2 people's worth of morning rituals. Margaret used to wake up early on Christmas too, but her energy was different. Excited, anticipatory, already planning the timing of the turkey and the coordination of side dishes. She'd wear her red flannel robe and fuzzy slippers, and she'd hum while she made coffee, filling the kitchen with melodies that made the whole day feel possible. I shower and shave with extra care, taking time with the details Margaret used to notice. The part in my hair, the way my collar sits, the small adjustments that make the difference between looking presentable and looking like I've given up. In the mirror, I practice the expression I'll need today. Pleasant but not eager, interested but not desperate. The face of a man who's comfortable with his place in the world, even when that place has been carved down to the size of a single chair in a too large house. The suit fits the way good clothes should, though it hangs a bit looser than it did when Margaret was alive to monitor my eating habits. She used to worry that I'd waste away without her supervision, leaving me casseroles and careful instructions for reheating. What she couldn't have predicted was how grief would make food taste like obligation, how even the simplest meals would become negotiations between hunger and the effort required to satisfy it. Downstairs, I make coffee and toast. Eating standing at the kitchen counter while looking out at the bird feeder, Margaret insisted we install for winter entertainment. A cardinal appears, bright red against the white background, and for a moment, I remember the way she'd pause whatever she was doing to watch the birds, how she'd keep a little notebook of the species she spotted and worry about them during the coldest days. The grandfather clock chimes 8 times. 6 hours until I need to leave for David's house. 6 hours to fill with activities that don't include dwelling on the conversation that's waiting for me. I could shovel the driveway, though the snow is light and the forecast doesn't call for more. I could organize the basement workshop, though the tools haven't moved since the last time I organized them. I could call someone, though the list of people who might welcome a call on Christmas morning has dwindled to names that feel more like acquaintances than friends. Instead, I find myself in the living room, looking at the Christmas tree with its careful arrangement of ornaments that tell the story of a marriage in miniature. The glass ball with First Christmas 1975 painted in gold script. The wooden angel David made in 2nd grade, lopsided but treasured. The collection of small ceramic houses Margaret added each year, building a tiny village that lived on our tree for 11 months, and in tissue paper for 1. Last night, decorating the tree alone felt like an act of defiance, a refusal to let Christmas die just because Margaret had. This morning, it feels more like a conversation with ghosts, each ornament a reminder of rituals that no longer have witnesses, traditions that have become exhibitions of stubborn habit rather than expressions of joy. The phone rings, David again, though it's earlier than his usual Sunday calls. "Merry Christmas, Dad. Merry Christmas, son. How are you doing this morning? I know today can be difficult. Difficult. The word that's supposed to encompass the particular loneliness of holidays when half your life has been subtracted, leaving you to perform celebrations for an audience of 1. I'm fine, David. Looking forward to this afternoon. Good, that's good. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up about something. Claire's parents brought some paperwork they thought you might be interested in looking at. Investment stuff, estate planning. Tom's been working on some new strategies for people in your situation. My situation. Widowed, aging, presumably in need of guidance from people who measure worth in portfolio performance and tax optimization strategies. What kind of paperwork? Nothing urgent, just some ideas about asset management, ways to make your money work more efficiently. Claire's dad has been doing this for 40 years, and Tom's got some innovative approaches for people who want to simplify their financial obligations. Simplify. The euphemism that means surrendering control to people who believe they're better qualified to manage what you've spent a lifetime building. I have a financial advisor, David, have had one for 20 years. I know, this would just be a second opinion. A family consultation, really, something to think about over the holidays. I grip the phone tighter, feeling the familiar pressure behind my ribs that comes when conversations veer toward territory I don't want to explore. And the cabin factors into this consultation? A pause, long enough for me to hear Claire's voice in the background again, urgent and insistent. The cabin's part of your overall portfolio, yes. But Dad, this isn't about taking anything away from you. It's about making sure you're positioned for whatever comes next. You're 70 years old. The cabin requires a lot of maintenance, a lot of physical work. Maybe it's time to think about other options. Other options, like selling to developers who will tear down the place Margaret and I built by hand and replace it with something modern and soulless. Like watching strangers swim off the dock where David learned to dive, where Margaret used to sit with her morning coffee and plan the day's activities. We'll talk about it this afternoon, I say, keeping my voice level. Absolutely, and Dad, come hungry. Claire's making her famous prime rib. Claire's famous prime rib, which she learned to make from a YouTube video, and has prepared exactly 3 times, each one resulting in meat that's either undercooked or dried to leather consistency. But Claire doesn't cook for flavor. She cooks for presentation, for the Instagram-worthy photos that document her version of domestic perfection. After David hangs up, I pour a second cup of coffee and sit in Margaret's chair, the smaller one with the floral upholstery she chose because it adds femininity to all this masculine furniture. From here, I can see the mantel with its collection of Christmas cards from people whose lives have moved forward while mine has contracted. The Andersons in Arizona, the McKinneys in Florida, the handful of couples who survived retirement and relocation, and the gradual winnowing that comes with age. None of them mentions Margaret anymore, though she's been gone 3 years. Not because they don't remember her or care about my loss, but because mentioning the dead makes people uncomfortable. It reminds them of their own mortality, their own vulnerability. It's easier to write, "Hope you're doing well," than to acknowledge that some losses never stop echoing. I think about Marcus Holcomb sitting in his law office, probably wondering if I'll change my mind about the papers I signed last week. Marcus has been our family attorney for 25 years, handling everything from wills to property transfers to the incorporation of Holbrook Construction. He's the kind of lawyer who asks hard questions and refuses to accept easy answers, who understood exactly what I was doing when I walked into his office with my request. "You sure about this, Frank?" he'd asked, reviewing the documents one more time. "Once this is in motion, it's going to be very difficult to undo." "I'm sure," I'd told him, and I was. The kind of sureness that comes not from impulse, but from months of careful consideration, from lying awake at night and working through every possible outcome, every potential consequence. The papers are simple enough. A trust document that transfers ownership of the lake house to the Minnesota Veterans Assistance Foundation, with a provision allowing me to remain as caretaker for the rest of my natural life. The foundation gets a valuable property for their veteran retreats program, and I get the satisfaction of knowing the place will be used by people who understand the value of service and sacrifice. What David and Claire don't know, what they won't know until this afternoon, is that the cabin is no longer mine to give away. It belongs to men and women who've earned the right to fish from that dock and sit by that fireplace and remember what they've lost and what they've preserved. The clock chimes 9 times. I finish my coffee and rinse the cup, placing it in the dishwasher next to yesterday's dishes. The wine for tonight sits on the counter, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with a bow that Margaret would have called perfectly adequate. It's a good bottle, expensive enough to satisfy Claire's need for status symbols, old enough to impress her father, who fancies himself a connoisseur. By 10 o'clock, I'm dressed and ready, though I don't need to leave for 5 hours. The morning stretches ahead like a held breath, empty time that needs to be filled with something other than anticipation and memory. I could read, though concentration has become elusive since Margaret died. I could watch television, though Christmas morning programming seems designed for families with children and unlimited tolerance for sentiment. Instead, I find myself in the basement workshop, running my hands over tools I've accumulated over 50 years of building and fixing and maintaining. The circular saw that cut every board for the cabin's deck. The hand planes that smoothed the custom trim work in this house. The measuring tools that ensured everything fit the way it was supposed to. That turned raw materials into spaces where people could live and love and feel secure. These tools know my hands the way Margaret knew my moods, responding to pressure and angle and intention in ways that feel like conversation. But they also remind me of what I'm no longer able to do, of the physical limitations that have crept in while I wasn't paying attention, the tremor in my left hand that makes precision work difficult, the way my back seizes up after an hour of bent-over concentration, the gradual admission that some projects are beyond me now, that some repairs require younger hands and stronger backs. David doesn't understand this relationship with work and tools and the satisfaction of building something that will outlast the builder. His career in software development involves creating products that become obsolete within years, solving problems that exist only in digital space. He's successful by any reasonable measure: comfortable salary, nice house, respect from colleagues who value innovation over durability. But he's never built anything permanent, never felt the weight of responsibility that comes with knowing people will live inside something you've created, that the quality of your work affects the safety and comfort of strangers for decades to come. He's never experienced the particular pride of driving past a building you designed and constructed, knowing that your craftsmanship is holding up against weather and time and the daily assault of human occupancy. This is what he doesn't understand about the cabin, about why I can't simply hand it over like a stock certificate or a savings account balance. The cabin isn't just an asset, it's a physical manifestation of everything Margaret and I dreamed and planned and built together. Every board was chosen specifically, every nail was driven with intention, every detail was debated and decided by two people who understood that they were creating more than shelter. They were building a place where memories could root and grow. The workshop clock shows 11:30. Time to head upstairs to spend the remaining hours before departure in activities that don't involve tools or memory, or the kind of physical work that reminds me of what I used to be capable of accomplishing. Instead, I climb the stairs slowly, feeling each step in my knees and lower back, and make my way to the bedroom where Margaret's jewelry box still sits on the dresser. Inside, beneath the small collection of rings and earrings she accumulated over our marriage, is the key to the cabin's front door. A simple brass key, worn smooth by 40 years of use, attached to a wooden keychain David made in shop class when he was 12. I hold the key up to the window, letting the winter light catch the metal surface. Tonight, when David and Claire present their carefully rehearsed arguments about asset management and financial efficiency and the burden of maintaining a property I can no longer properly care for, I'll have something to show them. But it won't be this key. It will be a copy of the trust documents that transferred ownership to people who understand the difference between a house and a home, between property and place, between giving something away and having it taken from you. The snow has stopped falling, leaving the world outside looking pristine and untouched. In a few hours, I'll drive through this landscape to my son's house, where I'll sit at a table with people who have never built anything with their hands and listen to them explain why I should give away the most precious thing I have left. They expect me to be grateful for their attention, compliant in my grief, eager to simplify my life according to their definition of simplicity. They think they're dealing with an old man who's lost his way, who needs guidance and management, and the kind of patient assistance reserved for people who can no longer be trusted with important decisions. Today, they're going to discover how wrong they are about that. The drive to David's house takes me through neighborhoods where Christmas morning unfolds behind warm windows, families in pajamas around decorated trees, children's voices carrying across snow-covered yards, the kind of domestic contentment that used to feel like my natural habitat. Now, these scenes feel like exhibits in a museum of lives I used to understand, reminders of a version of Christmas that died with Margaret. Highland Park in December looks like a real estate developer's vision of affluent family life. The houses are larger than necessary, the lawns too perfect to have been achieved without professional intervention, the Christmas decorations coordinated to suggest wealth without ostentation. David and Claire's Tudor revival sits on a corner lot, its limestone facade and leaded glass windows, projecting the kind of understated elegance that costs twice as much as anything flashy. I park behind Claire's Mercedes and Tom's BMW, expensive vehicles that make my 10-year-old Ford look like it wandered in from a different economic bracket. The wine sits in a gift bag on the passenger seat, and I carry it like an offering, though I suspect today's conversation will reveal that I'm less a guest than a subject under discussion. Claire answers the door wearing a burgundy dress that probably cost more than I spend on groceries in 2 months. Her smile is bright and practiced, the kind reserved for people who require careful management. "Frank, Merry Christmas. You look wonderful." She kisses my cheek with lips that smell like expensive perfume, and nothing like the Chanel No. 5 that Margaret wore on special occasions. Behind her, the house glows with warm light and the kind of Christmas decorations that were clearly coordinated by someone with professional design experience. "Thank you for having me, Claire. You look lovely yourself." David appears from the living room wearing a cashmere sweater and the kind of casual confidence that comes from hosting events in a house that was designed to impress. He hugs me with the careful affection of a son who's fulfilling his obligations to a difficult parent. "Dad, great to see you. Come in, come in. Everyone's here already." Everyone. The word carries weight, suggesting I'm the last to arrive at my own family's Christmas celebration. Not fashionably late, just late enough to make others wait, to require explanations and adjustments to the carefully planned schedule. The living room could be featured in a magazine spread about holiday entertaining. The tree reaches to the 10-foot ceiling, decorated in gold and burgundy, with the kind of ornaments that match rather than accumulate. No handmade angels or painted glass balls here, just expensive baubles that photograph well and suggest sophisticated taste. Claire's parents occupy the cream-colored sofa, holding crystal glasses of what I assume is expensive wine. Gerald Morrison is 73, my age exactly, but he wears his years differently. Silver hair carefully styled, clothing that suggests regular exercise and professional tailoring, the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. His wife Patricia sits beside him, elegant in the way of women who've spent their lives being photographed at charity events and country club functions. Tom stands by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel in a pose that suggests he's comfortable treating other people's homes as his personal stage. His girlfriend, a blonde woman whose name I don't remember, but whose youth suggests this relationship has more to do with status than connection, perches on the edge of an antique chair, looking like she's afraid of leaving marks on the upholstery. "Frank!" Gerald stands and extends his hand with the firm grip of a man who's closed countless deals through the simple application of confidence and charm. "Wonderful to see you again. How are you holding up?" Holding up. The phrase that acknowledges loss while suggesting that the appropriate response is resilience, that grief should be managed rather than experienced, that moving forward is more important than looking back. "I'm well, Gerald. Thank you for asking." Patricia offers her cheek for a kiss that lands somewhere in the vicinity of her carefully applied makeup. "Frank, dear, you look thin. Are you eating properly?" The question carries the implication that without female supervision, men become incapable of basic self-care, that widowhood automatically translates into decline and neglect. "I'm managing fine, Patricia." Tom approaches with the easy swagger of a man who's never doubted his welcome anywhere. "Frank, good to see you. Dad's been telling me about some opportunities that might interest you. Investment stuff, portfolio optimization, things that could really benefit someone in your position." My position. Another euphemism for widowed, aging, and presumably in need of financial guidance from people young enough to be my children. "I'm always interested in learning new things," I say, though the words feel like ash in my mouth. Claire appears with a glass of wine, presenting it with the careful attention of a hostess who's read articles about proper entertaining. The wine is good, probably too good for my palate, which was trained on beer and occasional whiskey rather than vintages that require educated appreciation. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour," she announces. I thought we could visit first, catch up, maybe discuss some of the ideas Gerald and Tom have been working on. The agenda reveals itself with the subtle efficiency of a business meeting disguised as family gathering, pre-dinner conversation designed to soften resistance, wine to encourage agreeability, the comfortable setting to suggest that what's being proposed is in everyone's best interest. I take the offered seat in a wingback chair that positions me facing the group like a defendant before a panel of judges. The fire crackles in the limestone fireplace, casting warm light across faces that watch me with the careful attention of people preparing to deliver news they believe I need to hear. Frank, Gerald begins, settling back into the sofa with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling conversations. Tom's been telling me about your situation, the cabin, the maintenance requirements, the isolation. It sounds like quite a burden for someone at your stage of life. My stage of life. Age as a form of incompetence, time as an enemy rather than an accumulation of experience and wisdom. The cabin's been in our family for 40 years, I say quietly. Margaret and I built it together. Of course, Patricia interjects with the kind of sympathy that's designed to make disagreement seem unreasonable. But Margaret's gone now, dear, and you're rattling around in that big house all alone, trying to maintain a second property that must require constant attention. Rattling around. The image of an old man lost in spaces too large for his diminished life, a burden to himself and others, incapable of making rational decisions about his own welfare. Tom leans forward, assuming the posture of someone delivering good news. The thing is, Frank, properties like that cabin are incredibly valuable right now. Lakefront real estate in Minnesota is absolutely booming. We're talking about potentially significant returns, money you could put to work in more practical ways. Practical ways, investments that generate profit rather than memories, assets that can be managed by professionals rather than maintained by aging hands. What kind of returns, I ask, though I already know where this conversation is heading. Conservatively, we're looking at high six figures, maybe 7, depending on market conditions and buyer interest. That kind of money, properly invested, could generate income that would make your life considerably more comfortable. Comfortable. The goal that's supposed to justify abandoning everything meaningful in favor of something measurable. David speaks for the first time since the conversation began, his voice carrying this carefully modulated tone of a son who's rehearsed this moment. Dad, I know this is hard to think about, but we're worried about you. The cabin's 2 hours away. If something happened, if you fell, if you had a medical emergency, there'd be no one around to help, and the maintenance alone must be exhausting. Exhausting. The assumption that what once brought joy and satisfaction has become a burden, that competence erodes with age until simple tasks become insurmountable challenges. I sip the wine, letting the silence stretch while I consider my response. Around the room, faces watch me with expressions that range from patient sympathy to barely concealed calculation. These people have already decided what's best for me. They're simply waiting for me to accept their conclusion. The cabin means a great deal to me, I say finally. It's where Margaret and I spent our happiest times, where David learned to fish and swim and drive a boat, where we planned to grow old together. But she's not there anymore, Frank, Gerald says gently. She's not anywhere. And holding on to places because of memories, well, that's not always the healthiest way to process loss. The healthiest way to process loss. Grief as a condition requiring management, love as an attachment that should be severed once its object is no longer present. Claire stands and smooths her dress with the efficient movement of a woman who's timed this intervention precisely. Why don't I start bringing out dinner? We can continue this conversation over the meal. Sometimes these decisions feel less overwhelming when we're not thinking of them as all or nothing propositions. All or nothing propositions. As if there's a middle ground between keeping the place where your marriage lived and handing it over to strangers who will measure its value in square footage and lot lines. The dining room table could seat 12, though tonight it's set for 7, with the kind of careful attention to detail that suggests Claire studied hospitality magazines before arranging the crystal and china. The prime rib sits at the center, perfectly carved and presented, surrounded by side dishes that look professionally prepared. I take my assigned seat at the far end of the table, positioned so that conversations must flow around me rather than including me as an equal participant. The wine flows freely, and the discussion ranges across safe topics: travel plans, investment opportunities, mutual acquaintances who've made smart decisions about downsizing and lifestyle simplification. But underneath the polite conversation, I can feel the current pulling toward the moment when subtlety will be abandoned and the real purpose of this gathering will be revealed. The paperwork Tom mentioned sits in a leather portfolio beside his chair, waiting for the appropriate moment to make its appearance. That moment comes during dessert, when the wine has done its work and everyone feels sufficiently relaxed to address the elephant in the room. Tom produces the portfolio with the casual confidence of a man who's closed similar deals countless times. "Frank, I took the liberty of having our legal team draft some preliminary documents. Nothing binding, just some options for you to consider. Ways to structure a sale that would minimize tax implications and maximize your return." He slides the papers across the table with the smooth efficiency of a man who's learned to make complicated transactions seem simple and inevitable. The documents are professionally prepared, full of legal language that's designed to inspire confidence while obscuring the fundamental transaction being proposed. I don't reach for them. Instead, I look around the table at faces that watch me with expressions ranging from encouraging patience to barely concealed impatience. "You've all put a lot of thought into this," I say quietly. "We care about you, Dad," David says, though his tone suggests he's repeating something he's been coached to say. "We want what's best for you, what's best for me." The phrase that justifies any action, any decision, any intervention that serves someone else's definition of my welfare. I reach into my jacket pocket and withdraw a folded envelope, placing it on the table next to Tom's legal documents. The paper is simple, unadorned, bearing only my name written in Marcus Holcomb's careful handwriting. "I appreciate your concern," I say, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "But I'm afraid the cabin isn't available." "I appreciate your concern," I say, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "But I'm afraid the cabin isn't available for sale." The words land in the room like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of confusion that spread across faces that had been so certain of the evening's outcome. Tom's confident smile falters. Gerald sets down his wine glass with a small clink that sounds unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "What do you mean, not available?" Claire asks, her hostess composure slipping just enough to reveal something sharper underneath. I unfold the envelope slowly, deliberately, the way I used to unfold blueprints when explaining construction details to clients who thought they understood building better than the man they'd hired to do the work. "I mean," I say, sliding the document across the polished mahogany surface, "that as of last Tuesday, the Whitefish Lake property is no longer mine to sell." David reaches for the papers first, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might be panic. His lips move silently as he reads, processing language that transforms their carefully orchestrated intervention into an exercise in futility. "This is..." He begins, then stops, reading the document again, as if the words might change upon closer inspection. "This says you donated the cabin to the Minnesota Veterans Assistance Foundation." "That's correct." Tom leans forward, his easy confidence replaced by the focused attention of a man who's just discovered that his supposedly simple transaction has become considerably more complicated. "When did you do this?" "Last Tuesday, though I'd been considering it for several months." The silence that follows has weight and texture, filled with unspoken calculations and rapidly shifting expectations. Patricia's hand trembles slightly as she reaches for her wine glass. Gerald's face has taken on the carefully neutral expression of a man who's just realized he's been outmaneuvered by someone he'd underestimated. "You can't be serious," Claire says, her voice rising just enough to crack the veneer of polite family discussion. "You gave away $1 million property to strangers?" "Not strangers, veterans, men and women who served their country and deserve a place where they can find some peace." David sets the document down as if it might contaminate him, his eyes moving from the papers to my face with an expression I haven't seen since he was a teenager caught in a lie that had grown too large to maintain. "Dad, this is insane. You can't just give away family property without discussing it with family." "It was my property," I say quietly. "Margaret left it to me. I was free to do with it as I saw fit." "But we're your family." Claire's composure cracks completely, revealing the calculating anger that's been simmering beneath her holiday hostess performance. We're the people who care about you, who visit you, who worry about you living alone in that house. Visit me. The word hangs in the air, heavy with irony. 3 visits in the past year, each one carefully timed and structured around specific requests or obligations. Worry about me living alone in a house I built with my own hands, maintained with my own labor, filled with 47 years of marriage and memories. This foundation, Gerald says, studying the document with the clinical attention of a man who's spent his career reading contracts and finding loopholes. They've given you lifetime residency rights. You can still use the property. That's correct. As long as I'm alive and capable, I can stay at the cabin whenever I choose. When I'm gone, it becomes a full-time retreat for veterans who need a place to heal. Tom's face has gone through several color changes during this conversation, settling on a mottled red that suggests either anger or the beginning of a stroke. Do you have any idea what you've done? The tax implications alone, and the lost opportunity cost? Frank, this is financial suicide. Financial suicide, the death of profit potential, the murder of investment opportunities, the self-inflicted wound of choosing meaning over money. I know exactly what I've done, I say, standing slowly from my chair with the deliberate movement of a man who's finished with justifying his decisions to people who've never understood what those decisions cost. I've ensured that the place Margaret and I built together will be used by people who understand the value of service and sacrifice. David stands as well, his face cycling through emotions too quickly for any single one to take hold. You did this to hurt us, to punish us for caring about your welfare. The accusation hangs between us like smoke, acrid and bitter. For a moment, I see the boy he used to be, the child who threw tantrums when he didn't get his way, who assumed that any decision that didn't benefit him was automatically wrong, who never learned the difference between love and control. I did this, I say, my voice carrying the weight of 70 years and 47 years of marriage and 3 years of learning to live alone, to preserve something that matters more than money. I reach for my coat, hanging on the back of my chair like an escape route I'd planned before sitting down. The room watches me with the stunned attention of people who've just witnessed an accident they didn't see coming. Frank, Patricia says, her voice carrying the strained sweetness of someone who's just realized that charm and manipulation have their limits. Surely we can discuss this. Maybe there's a way to modify the arrangement. There isn't. I slide my arms into the coat sleeves, each movement deliberate and final. The papers are signed, filed, and recorded. The cabin belongs to people who've earned it. Claire stands abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. This is what we get for including you in our family, for caring about you, for trying to help you make rational decisions about your future? Our family. Possessive and conditional, dependent on my compliance with their definition of rational behavior. This is what you get, I say, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since arriving, for assuming that grief makes a man stupid. I move toward the door, leaving behind the carefully prepared meal and the expensive wine, and the papers that were supposed to make surrendering my wife's memory feel like a smart financial decision. Behind me, voices rise in urgent discussion. Damage control and damage assessment. The rapid recalculation of expectations and entitlements. David follows me to the front door, his footsteps quick and angry on the marble floor. Dad, wait, please, we can fix this. I turn to face him one last time, this man who shares my name and Margaret's eyes, but nothing of the values we tried to teach him. Snow has begun falling again, soft flakes that catch the porch light and disappear into the growing darkness. There's nothing to fix, David. I made a decision about my own property, and I'm comfortable with that decision. But the money will do more good in the hands of veterans than it would have done sitting in Tom's investment portfolio. His face crumples slightly, revealing something vulnerable beneath the anger and calculation. We were trying to take care of you. No, I say, my breath visible in the cold air. You were trying to take care of yourselves. There's a difference. I walk to my truck without looking back, each step deliberate and sure, despite the snow beginning to accumulate on the walkway. Behind me, the warm light spills from David's house onto the perfect lawn, illuminating a world where Christmas dinner has become something else entirely. The drive home takes me through the same neighborhoods I'd passed earlier, but now the warm windows and happy families feel less like exclusion and more like a reminder that love takes many forms. Some families gather around dining room tables and plan each other's futures. Others consist of one old man and a house full of memories, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some things are worth more than their market value. The house welcomes me back with familiar sounds and smells, the tick of the grandfather clock, the whisper of heat through the vents, the faint scent of Margaret's perfume that still lingers in unexpected places despite 3 years of absence. I hang up my coat and loosen my tie, trading the costume of family obligation for the comfortable clothes of a man who's finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. In the kitchen, I make a sandwich from Christmas leftovers that don't exist, settling instead for soup from a can and crackers that Margaret would have called perfectly adequate for a light supper. The taste doesn't matter. What matters is the choice, eating when I'm hungry, what I want to eat, without consultation or compromise or the careful choreography of shared meals. The whiskey bottle still sits on the side table, unopened and waiting. Tonight feels like the right time, not for celebration, but for acknowledgement. I pour 2 fingers into a glass that Margaret bought at a craft fair in Duluth, holding the amber liquid up to the lamplight the way she taught me to appreciate good whiskey. To the cabin, I say aloud, my voice carrying clearly in the empty house, and to the people who will understand what it means. The whiskey burns in the best possible way, warming my chest and settling into my bones like a reminder of why some pleasures are worth waiting for. Outside, the snow continues to fall, covering the world in fresh possibility. Tomorrow, I'll drive to the cabin and walk through rooms that still smell like Margaret's cooking and my sawdust. Spaces that will soon welcome people who understand the value of sanctuary. David will call, probably within the next few days. There will be apologies and recriminations, attempts at negotiation, and emotional manipulation. Tom will research legal options for challenging the donation. Claire will enlist her parents in campaigns designed to prove my incompetence or restore their access to assets they'd already spent in their imaginations. But the papers are signed and filed and beyond their reach. The cabin belongs to people who've lost things that can't be replaced, who understand that some gifts come without conditions or expectations of gratitude. Veterans who'll sit on the dock Margaret and I built and watch the sun set over water that's held the same beauty for centuries, indifferent to human schemes and financial calculations. I finish the whiskey and rinse the glass, setting it in the dishwasher next to today's dishes. The grandfather clock chimes 10 times, marking another Christmas come and gone. But this one feels different, not like an ending, but like a beginning. The first step into a life that's finally, entirely my own. In the bedroom, I fold the navy suit and hang it in the closet next to clothes I'll actually choose to wear. Garments selected for comfort rather than impression. Margaret's wedding ring quilt covers the bed, each fabric piece a reminder of our marriage's daily texture. The shirt I wore to David's graduation, the dress she chose for our anniversary dinner, the everyday clothes that witnessed an ordinary life lived with extraordinary love. Tonight, for the first time since Margaret died, the house doesn't feel too large or too empty. It feels exactly the right size for a man who's learned the difference between family and people who share your blood, between love and control, between giving and having something taken from you. Tomorrow will bring new challenges and old resentments, phone calls and legal consultations, and the continued effort to undo what can't be undone. But tonight, Christmas night, I fall asleep in my own bed, in my own house, surrounded by my own choices, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some victories are worth more than the relationships they cost. The snow continues to fall, covering David's perfect lawn and my modest walkway with the same indiscriminate grace, reminding anyone who cares to notice that nature doesn't distinguish between the deserving and the demanding. It simply covers everything equally and lets the morning sort out what remains. The phone started ringing at 7:30 the next morning, pulling me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in months. Through the bedroom window, the world looked pristine under its blanket of fresh snow, unmarked except for the delicate tracks of rabbits and the deeper prints of the neighbor's dog. For a moment, lying in the warmth of Margaret's quilt, I allowed myself to imagine that yesterday's conversation had been nothing more than an unpleasant dream. Then the answering machine clicked on, and David's voice filled the house with the particular urgency of a man who'd spent the night calculating losses. "Dad, it's me. We need to talk about yesterday. There might be legal options we haven't considered. Call me back." I didn't. Instead, I made coffee and toast, eating breakfast at the kitchen counter. While watching cardinals work the bird feeder, Margaret had insisted we keep stocked through the winter. Their bright red presence against the white landscape reminded me of her theory that God painted cardinals that color, specifically to give people hope during the gray months. The machine recorded 4 more calls before noon. David, increasingly agitated. Claire, her voice tight with the kind of controlled anger that comes from realizing you've been outmaneuvered. Tom, offering what he called damage control consultation. Gerald, suggesting that family discussions might resolve what he termed this unfortunate misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? As if my decision to donate property I'd owned for 40 years was somehow based on confusion rather than careful consideration. I let them all talk to the machine while I went about the business of being alone on the day after Christmas. Dishes from last night's simple supper, laundry that had been waiting since before the holiday, the small maintenance tasks that keep a house functioning when there's only one person to notice if things start falling apart. Around 2 o'clock, Marcus Holcomb called. Unlike the others, his voice carried the calm authority of a man who dealt in facts rather than emotions. "Frank, I've had some interesting calls this morning. Seems your family's hired Peter Hartman to look into the foundation transfer." Hartman. I knew the name. Expensive attorney who specialized in elder law and estate disputes. The kind of lawyer wealthy families hired when they needed to challenge decisions made by aging relatives. "Let them look," I said. "The paperwork's solid." "It is, but they're claiming diminished capacity, possible undue influence. Standard approach when family members want to challenge charitable donations." Diminished capacity. The legal euphemism for senility, for the assumption that advancing age automatically translates into compromised judgment. "What do you need from me?" Documentation. Medical records showing you're mentally competent. Financial records proving you weren't coerced. Maybe a psychological evaluation if they push hard enough. The idea of subjecting myself to tests designed to prove my sanity felt both insulting and necessary. But I'd known this might come when I'd signed the papers, had prepared myself for the possibility that my own family would challenge my mental fitness rather than accept my right to make decisions about my own property. "Whatever it takes, Marcus, I'm not backing down." "Didn't think you would, but Frank, this is going to get ugly. Family disputes always do." After we hung up, I sat in Margaret's chair and looked at the Christmas tree, its lights twinkling cheerfully despite the storm gathering around me. The ornaments told the story of a marriage and a family that had once felt solid, permanent, proof against the kind of conflicts that destroyed other people's relationships. But families, like houses, are only as strong as their foundations, and apparently our foundation had been more fragile than I'd understood. The afternoon brought a different kind of call, a woman's voice, professional but warm, introducing herself as Linda Peterson from the Minnesota Veterans Assistance Foundation. "Mr. Holbrook, I wanted to call personally to thank you for your incredible generosity. The cabin will make a perfect retreat for our participants." For the first time since yesterday's dinner, I felt something ease in my chest. "Tell me about your program." "We work with veterans dealing with PTSD, depression, adjustment disorders. The idea is to provide a peaceful environment where they can process their experiences, connect with others who understand what they've been through. A place like your cabin, private, beautiful, with that sense of permanence, it's exactly what we've been hoping to find. Permanence, the word that had driven my decision, the quality that separated lasting value from temporary profit. My wife and I spent 40 years making that place feel like home. I hope your veterans will find some peace there." "They will, and Mr. Holbrook, your lifetime residency arrangement means you'll be able to see the difference you're making. You'll be part of the healing process." After she hung up, I found myself crying for the first time since Margaret's funeral. Not from sadness, but from the relief of knowing that something good would come from all this chaos, that the place where Margaret and I had been happiest would continue to serve a purpose that honored rather than exploited its beauty. The evening brought a knock at the door. David stood on the porch, shoulders hunched against the cold, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent the day trying to solve a problem that had no solution. "Can I come in, Dad?" I stepped aside, letting him enter but not offering the kind of welcome that suggested forgiveness. In the living room, he took the same chair he'd always preferred as a child, though now he looked uncomfortable in it, as if the furniture itself had turned against him. "I've been thinking about yesterday," he began, his voice carrying none of the confident authority he'd displayed at dinner. "About what you said, about us trying to take care of ourselves instead of you." I waited, offering nothing that might make this conversation easier for him. "Maybe you're right. Maybe we got so focused on the practical aspects that we forgot. Other things. Love, respect, the possibility that a 70-year-old man might have reasons for his decisions that went deeper than financial planning. The cabin meant something to you and Mom. I understand that. But Dad, $1 million, that's not money you can afford to just give away. What if you get sick? What if you need specialized care?" The same arguments dressed in slightly softer language. Concern for my welfare that somehow always circled back to money and the control that came with managing it. "I have insurance, David. I have savings. I have everything I need to live comfortably for whatever time I have left. But nothing." My voice carried more edge than I'd intended, but some conversations required clarity rather than diplomacy. "You want to know why I gave away the cabin? Because yesterday, sitting at your table, listening to all of you discuss my life like I wasn't in the room, I realized something. You don't see me as your father anymore. You see me as a problem to be managed." His face crumpled slightly, revealing something younger and more vulnerable beneath the surface confidence. "That's not true." "Isn't it? When's the last time you visited just to visit? When's the last time you called to ask how I was doing, not to check if I was making decisions that met with your approval?" He couldn't answer, and his silence was more honest than any words could have been. "The cabin is gone, David. It belongs to people who will use it for something meaningful. That decision is final, and it's not up for discussion or legal challenge or family intervention." Claire thinks. I don't care what Claire thinks. This isn't about Claire or her parents or Tom's investment strategies. This is about a choice I made regarding property that belonged to me. He stood, pacing to the window that looked out on the street where he'd learned to ride a bicycle, where Margaret had taught him to identify birds by their calls, where we'd built a childhood that had somehow led to this moment of fundamental disconnect. "I don't understand you anymore," he said quietly. "The man who raised me wouldn't have made a decision like this without considering the impact on his family. The man who raised you," I said, "never had to watch his family treat him like an incompetent stranger whose wishes were irrelevant to their plans." The words hung between us like a bridge that had finally collapsed under too much weight. For a moment, I thought he might try to rebuild it, might find some way to acknowledge the truth of what I'd said and offer something resembling an apology. Instead, he turned toward the door, his movement carrying the finality of a man who'd run out of arguments. "This isn't over, Dad. The lawyers think there might be grounds for a challenge. Let them think whatever they want. But David?" He stopped, hand on the doorknob. "If you go forward with this legal challenge, if you try to prove I'm mentally incompetent to make decisions about my own property, you'll succeed in one thing. You'll lose me permanently." His shoulders sagged, but he didn't turn around. "You've already lost us," he said quietly, and left. I stood at the window and watched him walk to his car, brush snow from the windshield, and drive away through the quiet streets of the neighborhood where he'd grown up. The taillights disappeared around the corner, taking with them any illusion that this conflict might be resolved through conversation or compromise. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of the good whiskey, carrying it back to Margaret's chair where I could look at our wedding photo and remember a time when family meant something different than it apparently meant now. Her smile looked back at me from behind the glass, unchanged by time or disappointment, still carrying the confidence of a woman who'd believed that love could overcome any obstacle. "I did the right thing," I told her image. "I know you'd understand." The house settled around me with its familiar sounds of contentment, heat cycling through the vents, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the grandfather clock marking time with steady precision. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the world in the fresh possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to undermine my decision or prove my incompetence. But tonight, I sat in my own chair in my own house, surrounded by my own choices and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some things matter more than family approval. The whiskey warmed my chest and reminded me of evenings with Margaret when we'd plan improvements to the cabin or discuss David's future, or simply sit together in the comfortable silence of people who'd found their place in the world. Those evenings were gone, like so much else, but the peace they'd given me, that was mine to keep, regardless of what my son and his lawyers might decide to do about it. I finished the whiskey and prepared for bed, following routines that had sustained me through 3 years of widowhood and would continue to sustain me through whatever came next. In the bedroom, I folded back Margaret's quilt and lay down between sheets that smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she'd made from flowers grown in our own garden. The phone would ring again tomorrow. Lawyers would file papers and schedule hearings. Family members would plot strategies for overturning decisions they couldn't accept. But all of that existed in a world outside these walls, beyond the reach of a man who'd finally learned the difference between being loved and being managed. For the first time since Christmas dinner, I slept deeply and without dreams, protected by the simple knowledge that I'd done exactly what I'd intended to do, exactly the way Margaret would have wanted it done. January arrived with the kind of bitter cold that makes even short trips outdoors feel like expeditions to hostile territory. The house, built to withstand Minnesota winters, held its warmth like a fortress, but even the best insulation couldn't keep out the chill that came with certified mail and legal documents delivered by men in expensive overcoats. The formal challenge to my mental competency arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in the kind of legal language designed to make reasonable actions sound like evidence of diminished capacity. According to the petition filed by David Holbrook, Claire Holbrook, and retained counsel, Peter Hartman, I had exhibited signs of impaired judgment, possible dementia, and vulnerability to outside influence in making the decision to donate valuable real estate to a charitable organization. I read the papers twice, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee that had gone cold while I processed the clinical language that transformed my son into a concerned party seeking to protect an incompetent parent from his own poor decisions. The words felt abstract, disconnected from the reality of a man who'd spent 70 years making careful choices about everything from construction materials to life partners. Marcus arrived within an hour of my call, carrying his own briefcase full of documents and the grim expression of a lawyer who'd seen too many families destroy themselves in courtrooms. "They're requesting a full competency hearing," he said, spreading the papers across my dining room table like battle plans. "Medical evaluation, psychological testing, review of your financial decision-making over the past 5 years. They want to establish a pattern of declining judgment." What kind of pattern? They're claiming the cabin donation was just the latest in a series of questionable choices. Maintaining this house instead of moving to assisted living, refusing their advice about investments, living alone without adequate supervision. Living alone without adequate supervision. The phrase that reduced my independence to evidence of incompetence, my privacy to dangerous isolation. What do they get if they win? Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking older than his 68 years. Guardianship, legal authority to make decisions about your living situation, your finances, your medical care. Essentially, they'd become your legal parents. The irony was bitter enough to taste. The son I'd raised to be independent and self-sufficient now wanted legal authority to treat me like a child incapable of managing his own affairs. And the cabin? If they can prove the donation was made while you were mentally incompetent, they might be able to reverse it, force the foundation to return the property or pay its fair market value. I thought about Linda Peterson's voice when she'd called to thank me, about the veterans who were already planning retreats at the cabin, about the healing that was supposed to begin there in the spring. How do we fight this? With everything we have, medical records showing you're healthy, financial records proving you're competent, character witnesses who can testify to your judgment and independence. And Frank, yes, we need to show the court that your decision was reasonable, not just legal, that you had good reasons for the donation beyond spite or confusion. The medical evaluation took place on a Friday morning at Dr. Harrison's office, where I'd been a patient for 20 years. The tests were more extensive than my usual checkups: cognitive assessments, memory tests, questions designed to measure my ability to understand complex information and make rational decisions. Dr. Harrison, a man my own age who'd seen me through 2 minor surgeries and Margaret's final illness, conducted the examination with the thorough attention of someone who understood that his findings would be scrutinized by lawyers looking for evidence of decline. "Your cognitive function is excellent," he told me afterward, reviewing the test results. "Better than many patients 20 years younger. If someone's claiming you're mentally incompetent, they're either lying or they don't understand what competency means." The psychological evaluation was more invasive, conducted by Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 40s who specialized in geriatric mental health. She asked probing questions about my relationship with David, my feelings about Margaret's death, my reasons for living alone, rather than seeking what she called community support. "Tell me about the cabin donation," she said during our second session. "What motivated that decision?" I told her about the Foundation's mission, about veterans who needed healing spaces, about my belief that meaningful property should serve meaningful purposes. I told her about sitting at David's dinner table and realizing that my family saw me as an obstacle to their financial planning rather than a person with his own valid reasons for making decisions. "Some families struggle with aging parents who make choices that seem irrational," she said. "From your perspective, were your family members expressing legitimate concerns about your welfare?" The question was carefully neutral, designed to elicit an honest response rather than a defensive one. From their perspective, probably, but their concerns were based on assumptions about aging and independence that I don't share. They assume that being 70 means being incapable of making complex decisions. I disagree. Dr. Mitchell made notes in her file, her expression revealing nothing about her assessment of my mental state. "The donation represents a significant financial sacrifice. Some people might see that as evidence of impaired judgment. Some people measure value only in dollars. I don't." 2 weeks later, she submitted her report to the court. "Mr. Holbrook demonstrates clear thinking, appropriate emotional responses, and sound judgment. His decision to donate real estate to charity, while financially significant, appears to be based on rational consideration of his values and priorities, rather than mental impairment." But David and his lawyers weren't finished. They hired their own expert, Dr. Robert Kessler, who specialized in what he called financial abuse of elderly individuals. Without examining me, relying only on the information provided by my family, he submitted an opinion that the cabin donation fit a pattern of financial self-neglect common in elderly individuals suffering from depression and social isolation. Financial self-neglect, the clinical term for choosing meaning over money, for refusing to let asset management define the value of your remaining years. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for March, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Marcus warned me that family competency disputes were ugly affairs, that my son would be required to testify about my supposed decline, that private medical information would become public record. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked during one of our preparation sessions. "We could try to negotiate a settlement, maybe a partial reversal of the donation, some compromise that gives your family part of what they want." "No compromise," I said. "Either I'm competent to make decisions about my own property, or I'm not. If the court decides I'm not, then I'll live with the consequences. But I won't negotiate away my right to choose how I spend my final years." The weeks leading up to the hearing passed with the slow inevitability of winter giving way to spring. Snow melted into muddy patches that revealed the brown grass underneath. Trees began to show the first tentative signs of budding. The natural world prepared for renewal while my family prepared for legal battle. David called once during this period, his voice carrying the strained formality of someone fulfilling an obligation he'd rather avoid. "Dad, you know this isn't personal. We're worried about you. If you just consider moving somewhere with more support, maybe we could work something out. This became personal the moment you decided I was too incompetent to make my own decisions." "That's not what we're saying." "That's exactly what you're saying. You've hired lawyers to prove I'm mentally incapable of managing my own affairs. There's no other way to interpret that." He hung up without saying goodbye, and I knew it would be the last conversation we'd have before the hearing. Whatever relationship we might have salvaged through discussion or compromise had been sacrificed to legal strategy and the assumption that family love gave him the right to override my choices. On the Friday before the hearing, Linda Peterson called with an update about the cabin. "We've had our first group there," she said, her voice bright with enthusiasm. 8 veterans, all dealing with different challenges. They spent the weekend fishing, talking, just being quiet together. The feedback has been incredible. I'm glad to hear it. Mr. Holbrook, I want you to know that whatever happens with this legal situation, those men left the cabin feeling better than when they arrived. You've already made a difference in their lives. After she hung up, I sat in Margaret's chair and looked at our wedding photo, thinking about the different kinds of legacy a person could leave behind. Money invested wisely, property managed efficiently, assets passed down to children who would convert them into other forms of wealth, or peace given to people who'd served their country and needed a place to remember who they were before the war changed them. Margaret would have understood the choice I'd made. She'd always believed that the best things in life couldn't be measured in dollars, that true wealth came from using what you had to make other people's lives better. The hearing was scheduled for Monday morning. On Sunday evening, I opened the bottle of Macallan 18, pouring myself a glass that Margaret would have saved for a special occasion. This seemed special enough. The night before, I'd either be declared competent to live my own life or incompetent to manage my own affairs. The whiskey was everything it promised to be, smooth and complex, carrying flavors that spoke of time and patience and the kind of craftsmanship that couldn't be rushed. I raised the glass toward Margaret's photo, toasting a woman who'd never lived to see me fight for the right to honor her memory in my own way. "To tomorrow," I said aloud, my voice carrying clearly through the empty house, "and to choices that matter more than money." Outside, spring was coming, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Inside, an old man prepared for battle with his own family, armed with nothing more than the conviction that being loved shouldn't require surrendering the right to make your own decisions about what mattered most. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, marking another day closer to whatever verdict the court would render about my mental fitness. But regardless of what 12 strangers might decide about my competency, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I'd rather be declared mentally unfit by people who didn't understand my values than surrender those values to people who measured everything by its resale value. The whiskey warmed my chest and reminded me of better times, but it didn't make me nostalgic for a past that couldn't be recovered. Instead, it reminded me that some pleasures were worth waiting for, that patience and principle sometimes produce better results than compromise and accommodation. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and testimony, expert opinions, and family accusations. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my own house, drinking my own whiskey, surrounded by my own choices and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I'd fought for something worth fighting for. Whatever the court decided, I'd fought well. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. I sat beside Marcus at the plaintiff's table, though, in this case, I supposed I was the defendant, the man whose sanity was on trial. David sat across the aisle with Claire and the Morrisons, their expensive lawyer between them, like a shield. Judge Catherine Walsh was younger than I'd expected, maybe 55, with gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd heard every family dispute imaginable. She reviewed the case file with methodical attention before calling the proceeding to order. "This is a petition for guardianship based on alleged mental incompetency," she announced. "The petitioners claim that Frank Holbrook lacks the cognitive ability to make sound financial decisions. Mr. Holbrook contests this claim." Peter Hartman stood to present his case, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who'd done this many times before. He painted a picture of an isolated, grieving widower who'd been manipulated into making an irrational decision that would impoverish him in his final years. "Your Honor, the defendant donated property worth over $1 million to a charity he'd never previously supported, without consulting family members who love him and want what's best for his welfare. He called David to testify first. My son walked to the witness stand wearing his most expensive suit, his face carefully composed in an expression of reluctant duty. Under Hartman's questioning, he described a father who'd become increasingly reclusive since his wife's death, who rejected reasonable advice about downsizing, who made impulsive decisions without considering their consequences. He used to be so careful about money, David said, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned sadness. He built his construction business from nothing, planned every investment, but since Mom died, he's been different. Stubborn, angry when we try to help. Listening to him testify felt like watching a stranger describe someone I'd never met. This version of Frank Holbrook was a man diminished by grief, confused by isolation, vulnerable to manipulation by smooth-talking charity representatives who'd taken advantage of his weakened mental state. When Marcus cross-examined him, David's composure cracked slightly. "When did you last visit your father before Christmas dinner?" We talk regularly." "That wasn't the question. When did you last visit?" David's jaw tightened. "Maybe 6 months ago, but we call..." "6 months. And during that visit, did your father seem confused or disoriented?" "Not confused exactly, but withdrawn, not himself." "Not himself how?" "He talks to pictures of my mother. He keeps the house exactly like it was when she was alive. He won't consider practical changes that would make his life easier." Marcus let that hang for a moment. "Mr. Holbrook, is talking to photographs of deceased spouses a sign of mental illness?" "No, but..." "Is maintaining your home the way your wife liked it evidence of incompetency? When it prevents rational decision-making, like deciding to honor your wife's memory by donating property to veterans rather than selling it to fund your son's investment portfolio," Hartman objected, but the damage was done. David stepped down, looking smaller than when he'd taken the stand. Dr. Kessler testified next, presenting his opinion about elderly financial abuse without ever having examined me. He spoke about patterns of social isolation, depression-induced decision-making, and the vulnerability of aging individuals to unscrupulous charitable organizations. When Marcus questioned him, the doctor's confidence wavered. "You've never met Mr. Holbrook? I've reviewed extensive documentation, but you've never spoken with him, examined him, or assessed his mental state personally." "The documentation was sufficient for my analysis." "Documentation provided exclusively by the petitioners who want to prove his incompetency?" Dr. Kessler shifted uncomfortably. "Standard practice allows for evaluation based on reliable third-party information. Third-party information from people who stand to benefit financially if Mr. Holbrook is declared incompetent?" The afternoon belonged to our side. Dr. Harrison testified about my excellent cognitive function, my clear understanding of complex medical information, my rational responses to health challenges. Dr. Mitchell described our sessions in detail, emphasizing my coherent reasoning and appropriate emotional responses. Linda Peterson took the stand to describe the Veterans Program, the difference the cabin was already making in people's lives, the careful process by which the foundation had approached me about the donation. "Mr. Holbrook contacted us," she testified. "He'd researched our organization thoroughly before making any commitment. This wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the result of months of consideration. When I finally took the stand, the courtroom felt smaller, more intimate. Judge Walsh looked at me with curious attention, as if trying to reconcile the frail, confused man described by the petitioners with the person sitting before her. Marcus walked me through my background, my business experience, my 47-year marriage, my decision-making process regarding the cabin donation. I spoke clearly and deliberately, explaining my reasoning without defensiveness or anger. "The cabin represented the happiest years of my marriage," I said. "My wife and I always believed that meaningful places should serve meaningful purposes. When I learned about veterans who needed a peaceful place to heal, it seemed like the perfect way to honor what Margaret and I had built together." Under cross-examination, Hartman tried to paint my decision as emotional rather than rational, driven by grief rather than sound judgment. "Mr. Holbrook, didn't you feel pressured to make this donation quickly before family members could raise concerns?" "I felt no pressure except the desire to do something positive with property that held special meaning for me." "But surely you understood the financial implications?" "I understood them perfectly. I chose meaning over money. That's not incompetence. It's values." Judge Walsh recessed the court for deliberation. I sat in the hallway beside Marcus, watching David and Claire whisper urgently with their lawyer. Across the corridor, strangers moved through their own legal dramas, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from having private family matters aired in public forums. "How do you think it went?" I asked Marcus. "Better than I expected." Walsh seemed skeptical of their claims, but competency hearings are unpredictable. Sometimes judges err on the side of caution. An hour later, we were called back to hear the verdict. Judge Walsh had arranged her papers neatly, her expression revealing nothing about her decision. "The petitioners have failed to present convincing evidence of mental incompetency," she announced. Mr. Holbrook demonstrated clear thinking, appropriate reasoning, and sound judgment throughout this proceeding. His decision to donate real estate to charity, while financially significant, appears to be based on personal values rather than mental impairment. She looked directly at David. Family members who disagree with an elderly relative's choices cannot use the court system to override those choices simply because they find them financially unwise. The gavel fell with finality. I remained competent in the eyes of the law, free to make my own decisions about my property and my life. David and Claire left without speaking to me, their lawyer already discussing appeal options as they walked toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, spring had arrived in earnest. Trees were budding, grass was beginning to green, and the air carried the promise of warmer days ahead. I stood on the steps with Marcus, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in months. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you go home and live your life the way you choose to live it," Marcus said. "The cabin stays with the foundation, your competency is legally established, and your family can't challenge your decisions without starting this whole process over again." That evening, I called Linda Peterson to share the news. Her joy was audible through the phone line. "Mr. Holbrook, this is wonderful. We've already got 3 more groups scheduled for the cabin this spring. Your gift is going to help so many people." After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of the good whiskey and sat in Margaret's chair, looking at our wedding photo. The legal battle was over, but something else had ended too. Any possibility of reconciliation with David and Claire. The son who'd once looked up to me had chosen money over relationship, control over respect. But losing him had also freed me from the burden of trying to maintain a connection that had become more obligation than affection. I was 70 years old, financially secure, mentally competent, and finally free to live according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. The phone rang one last time that day. David's number appeared on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his message. "Dad, the lawyer says we could appeal, but maybe that's not worth it. Maybe we were wrong about some things. I don't know how to fix this, but I want you to know I don't know what I want you to know." His voice cracked slightly before the message ended. For a moment, I considered calling him back, offering some bridge across the divide that had opened between us. But bridges require foundation on both sides, and David had spent too many months trying to undermine mine. Instead, I deleted the message and turned off the phone. Tomorrow, I would drive to the cabin and spend a few days among the rooms where Margaret and I had been happiest. I would watch veterans arrive for their retreat and see firsthand the good that was coming from my decision. But tonight, I sat in my own house, drinking my own whiskey, surrounded by my own choices and the quiet satisfaction of having fought for something worth fighting for. The battle was over. I had won. And victory tasted exactly like 18-year-old scotch and the sweet silence of a man who'd finally learned that being loved shouldn't require surrendering the right to live according to your own values. Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal. Inside, an old man prepared for whatever came next, armed with legal vindication and the knowledge that some things, dignity, principle, the right to honor your wife's memory in your own way, were worth more than family harmony. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one of the most important days of my life. I finished the whiskey, checked the locks, and climbed the stairs to bed, where Margaret's quilt waited to cover me with 47 years of love and the promise that some victories were worth the relationships they cost. 6 months later, I stood on the cabin's deck, watching 8 veterans work quietly around the property. Some painted porch railings that had weathered another Minnesota winter. Others cleared brush from hiking trails Margaret had designed to wind through the woods behind the house. A few sat on the dock, fishing lines disappearing into water that reflected the same sky Margaret and I had watched for 40 years. These men and women moved with the careful attention of people who understood the value of peaceful work. who knew that some healing happened through the simple act of caring for beautiful places. They spoke little, but their presence filled the cabin with purpose in ways that family visits never had. Linda Peterson emerged from the kitchen, where she'd been organizing supplies for the week-long retreat. The foundation had upgraded the cabin's amenities, better accessibility, commercial-grade kitchen equipment, sleeping accommodations for 12, but they'd preserved the essential character Margaret and I had built into every room. "How does it feel?" she asked, joining me at the deck railing. "Like the place is finally being used the way it was meant to be used," I said. A loon called from across the lake, its voice carrying the same wild loneliness that had provided the soundtrack to countless evenings when Margaret and I sat in these same chairs, planning projects and talking through problems and simply enjoying the kind of silence that only comes when you're surrounded by water and trees and time that belongs entirely to you. "Your lifetime residency means you can come here whenever you want," Linda said. "The veterans love having you around. They say you know stories about every tree and rock and section of shoreline. Stories accumulated differently when you'd built a place with your own hands, when every improvement was a decision made jointly by two people who planned to grow old together, among rooms that reflected their shared vision of what home should feel like." David had never understood that connection between place and memory, between property and identity. I hadn't heard from him since the court hearing. Marcus mentioned that the appeals deadline had passed without action, that my competency ruling was now final and unassailable. My son had chosen legal strategy over relationship, and when that strategy failed, he'd apparently chosen silence over the harder work of rebuilding what he'd tried to destroy. Some losses were more liberating than painful. The veterans finished their work as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, creating the kind of golden light that makes even ordinary moments feel touched by something larger than themselves. They gathered on the deck for dinner, sharing stories and comfortable silences in equal measure. I ate with them, listening to conversations about places they'd served and people they'd lost, and the slow work of learning to live with memories that wouldn't stay buried. These men and women understood something about sacrifice that David had never learned, something about the difference between giving and having something taken from you. After dinner, I walked the trails Margaret had designed, following paths that wound through woods where we'd planned to spend our retirement years, exploring territory we'd mapped together during happier summers. The trees had grown taller in the 3 years since her death, filling in gaps and creating new patterns of shadow and light. At the small clearing where Margaret had wanted to build a meditation garden, I found a bench the veterans had constructed from fallen timber, positioned to catch the last rays of evening sun. A small plaque mounted to the backrest read, "In honor of Margaret Holbrook, who understood that the best places are built with love." I sat on the bench as darkness gathered around me, thinking about the different kinds of legacy a person could leave behind. Money managed carefully and passed down through generations. Property maintained and improved and eventually sold to the highest bidder. Or places that continued to serve purposes larger than profit, that provided healing and peace to people who had earned the right to both. Margaret would have loved seeing the cabin used this way, would have enjoyed the conversations with veterans and the satisfaction of knowing that what we'd built together was making a difference in lives she'd never know but would have cared about deeply. The drive home took me through the same small towns and rural landscapes where I'd spent my entire life, past construction projects I'd completed decades ago, and houses where families continued to live safely inside structures I'd built to last. Not all legacy could be measured in dollars or passed down through wills. Sometimes the most important things you left behind were the spaces where other people could find peace. Back in my own house, I poured a glass of wine, not the expensive bottle David and Claire had expected me to bring to Christmas dinner, but a simple red that Margaret would have called perfectly adequate for a quiet evening. The living room looked exactly as it had for the past 3 years, filled with furniture we'd chosen together, and photographs that documented a marriage built on shared values rather than shared assets. The phone hadn't rung in weeks. No urgent calls about family crises or financial decisions that required my immediate attention. No lawyers or doctors or well-meaning relatives who wanted to discuss my living situation or my mental capacity, or my stubborn refusal to accept their definition of what was best for my welfare. Just silence. The kind of silence that used to feel lonely, but now felt like freedom. I raised my glass toward Margaret's photograph, toasting a woman who'd never lived to see the final result of our shared investment in meaningful places, but who would have understood exactly why I'd chosen veterans over family, purpose over profit, principle over peace. To choices that matter more than money, I said aloud, my voice carrying clearly through the empty house that no longer felt too large or too quiet, but exactly the right size for a man who'd finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. Outside, spring continued its patient work of renewal. Inside, an old man settled into an evening routine that belonged entirely to him, surrounded by his own decisions and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that some battles were worth winning, regardless of what they cost. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another day in a life that had been simplified down to its essential elements: meaningful work, peaceful surroundings, and the knowledge that the place where his marriage had been happiest would continue to provide healing for people who understood the value of sanctuary. Some endings were also beginnings, some losses cleared space for better things. And sometimes the best way to honor love was to give it away to people who needed it more than those who simply expected it. I finished the wine, checked the locks, and climbed the stairs to bed, where Margaret's quilt waited to cover me with 47 years of love and the promise that some victories were worth whatever they cost. The cabin belonged to veterans now. The house belonged to me. And for the first time since Margaret died, that felt like exactly the right distribution of the things that mattered most.